Our next story, well, this particular story, it feels like a direct return to the Cold War politics. After Mr. Marco Rubio, he labeled Cuba a growing security concern, Havana reacted aggressively, accusing Washington of spreading fear and provoking tension. But what truly alarmed analysts was the growing discussion about Russia and China potentially increasing support for Cuba. Well, if tensions continue escalating, and that's a dangerous, dangerous level, ladies and gentlemen. Today's geopolitical environment, it is completely different from the post-Cold War era when America dominated globally and that too with very little opposition. Russia and China are now increasingly coordinating their efforts against the US influence worldwide. And let's be honest, Cuba's geographic position remains extremely sensitive because it sits only a short distance from the American territory, right? China has already expanded trade, infrastructure project, investment, diplomatic influence across Latin America, while Russia continues strengthening its ties with governments hostile to Washington. That deadly combination. It deeply worries the US strategists here. Some intelligence experts, they believe that America fears surveillance infrastructure or any military cooperation expanding very quietly near its borders. Nobody is openly talking about missiles or nuclear deployment yet, but the rhetoric itself, that is becoming more aggressive. And ladies and gentlemen, in geopolitics, perception often it shapes policy decision. If Washington believes hostile powers are building influence and that too near American territory, history shows America reacts forcefully. In the meantime, the Cuban people, they feel trapped in the middle of geopolitical struggle that is much larger than themselves. Blackout, inflation, shortages, migration, economic exhaustion, they all are already pushing many citizens towards depression. Young Cubans specifically fear that their country could become isolated again if tension worsens. But perhaps the biggest takeaway tonight is that the world's major fault lines are beginning to connect together. Iran tension, Russia tension, China tension, Cuba tension, different region increasingly tied into one larger confrontation between global powers. And that interconnected pressure, it may define the next decade of the world politics. And while America is fighting from multiple ends, Donald Trump has announced a 5,000 additional American troops for Poland this time. And it has kind of shocked entire Europe and created fresh uncertainty inside NATO. Well, European leaders, they are struggling to understand the larger strategy behind these sudden military decisions. First, there were discussions about reducing troop commitment in parts of Europe, right, if you remember? Then concern emerging about weakening American support for NATO, and then suddenly Poland is receiving thousands of additional US troops. Here, many analysts believe that Mr. Trump is reconstructing America's European military posture, and that too around governments that he personally sees as more politically aligned with him. Poland has strongly supported tougher position against Russia and has massively increased military spending in recent years. In fact, the country has purchased tanks, missile systems, fighter jets, artilleries, and air defense system because fears of Russian aggression that remains extremely high after the Ukraine war. But Moscow is watching these troop deployment very, very carefully. Well, Russia already claims that NATO expansion threatens its security, and every new American deployment, it becomes useful propaganda for the Kremlin. In the meantime, countries like Germany and France, they are increasingly uncomfortable with unpredictability coming from Washington. Well, ladies and gentlemen, European allies, they want long-term strategic stability, not any sudden policy change tied to domestic American politics. Here, some European leaders, they are now openly discussing whether Europe must eventually become less dependent on the United States for security protection or not. That conversation, it would have sounded literally impossible a few years ago. But today it is becoming more mainstream. And yes, at the very same time, NATO itself appears increasingly divided internally over spending, strategy, and military priorities. Some governments fear that Europe could become trapped in broader confrontation involving Russia, Iran, China, and that too without fully controlling its own security decisions. And beneath everything lies a deeper fear Is America quietly preparing Europe for a future where multiple global conflicts erupt simultaneously? Or is this mainly political signaling ahead of elections? Well, either way, Europe tonight looks nervous. It looks uncertain, increasingly aware that the global security order may be entering a dangerous new phase.